now we have a lot of space. I think we'll put on a couple of Satchmo's Town Hall discs there. Let's see this one in Vancouver. I bought it. It says here, Louis Armstrong's Town Hall concert. And there's a big picture of Louis Armstrong looking back over his shoulder. That's a treasure of immortal performances. Town Hall concert. The RCA Victor recordings contained on this record were made at a Louis Armstrong concert in Town Hall, New York City. The occasion was one of famous disc jockey Fred Robbins' one-night stand event presented by Ernest Anderson on that evening, April 24th, 1947. Fred Robbins introduced Louis Armstrong and his all-star group to the packed hall with these words.
Louis opens tonight with some of the golden things from his early OK days. And in another respect, this concert is unique. That is, we've surrounded Louis with the best jazz musicians obtainable. With Jack Teagarden on trombone, Bobby Hackett on trumpet, Sid Catlett on the drums, as well as George Weathering, Dick Carey at the piano, Bobby Haggart on bass. And so from the golden OK days, we give you the greatest figure in American jazz on the one-night stand, playing cornet chop suey, Louis Armstrong.
Hello and welcome to the Town Hall. I am Melay Araya and I am the host of this evening's program. The voice that you just heard was that of none other than the genius and legend Louis Armstrong. In that recording, he is reading liner notes from his 1947 live album recorded at the Town Hall. We thank Riccardi and the Louis Armstrong House Museum for providing the clip. Today is but one installment in a series entitled Century of Story and Song. The Town Hall was founded in 1921 by a group of suffragists who wanted the space to be a home for adult education, consciousness raising, and civil discussion. But we are known for our great music history, including our great jazz history, which includes Chana Pozzo, Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, Sarah Vaughan, Count Basie, Billie Holiday, so many, including the great Louis Armstrong. So thank you for joining us this evening for Louis Armstrong's Heart Full of Rhythm with Riccardi and Brad San Martin, the Apollo's Director of Digital Archives and my friend. We come to talk about Riccardi's newest book and to talk about Armstrong's years at both the Apollo and the Town Hall, and one particular period that we will ask Riccardi about and why he chose to write about it in this particular book. Just two bios to get through. These are some incredible people we get to speak to tonight. Brad is the Director of Digital Archives at the historic Apollo Theater in Harlem. Prior to that, he was a research assistant at the Southern Folklore Collection on the campus of the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And before then, he worked extensively in the music industry as a project manager, copywriter, and publicist, and has compiled, produced, and annotated a number of CD reissue projects. Ricky Riccardi is the Director of Research Collections at the Louis Armstrong House Museum and the author of What a Wonderful World, The Magic of Louis Armstrong's Later Years. His new book, Heart Full of Rhythm, The Big Band Years of Louis Armstrong, is scheduled to be released, actually it's out right now, on Oxford University's press. So go out and get it. He runs the online blog, The Wonderful World of Louis Armstrong, we'll put that below, and has given lectures on Armstrong at venues around the world, including the Institute of Jazz Studies, the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, the Bristol International Jazz and Blues Festival, and the Monterey Jazz Festival. He has taught a Music of Louis Armstrong graduate course at Queens College, in addition to a Swing University course on Armstrong at Jazz at Lincoln Center. He has co-produced numerous Armstrong reissues in recent years, including Satchmo at Symphony Hall 65th Anniversary, the complete concert, Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong Cheek to Cheek, the complete duets, Pop is Tops, the Verve studio albums, and 2 volumes of Decca singles for Universal Music, in addition to Columbia and RCA Victor live recordings of Louis Armstrong and the All-Stars for Mosaic Records. We'll be talking about the All-Stars today. He is also a working jazz pianist and received his master's in jazz history and research from Rutgers University. He lives in Toms River, New Jersey with his wife and their 3 daughters. Thank you, Brad and Ricky, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks for having us.
How are y'all doing today?
Happy to be here.
Well, congratulations on the book. It's been getting such a beautiful response. I think we all needed it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny thing. Ever since the pandemic hit, there's been this resurgence of interest in Louis Armstrong, and I think people are looking for something inspirational. People are looking for something just to turn off the news, turn off politics for a minute. And Louis Armstrong, he's there. You know, he got us through the Great Depression and through, the Civil Rights struggle, the Vietnam War. I mean, he's been the soundtrack of a lot of ups and downs, and he's still providing it, nearly 50 years after he's gone.
Yeah. And you, how are you doing today, Brad? How's your sort of stay at home been?
Oh, it's been reasonably productive. I live in Harlem, just down the street from the Apollo, so I'm lucky I can pop in and get a few things to work on, and we continue to just enrich the archives and continue to catalog and scan and process. So when I'm not doing that, I'm reading Ricky's new book, obviously.
I did not pay him to say that.
No. You didn't pay either of us to say it, but it's an incredible book.
Thank you.
And it's wonderful, once again, to hear his name said aloud, because when I read it, I definitely read it Louis. So it's great to hear Louis actually said. So thank you.
That's probably the most real quick. Yeah, that's probably the most common question I get, the whole Louis debate. And I always say, if you asked him his name, he responded Louis 100% of the time. And he said that his mother never called him Louis. And when he sang Hello, Dolly, he emphasized the Louis. And so that's why you'll hear me go with Louis. But having said that, his wife, all of his wives, his managers, the musicians in the band, they all called him Louis. We have the recordings. He didn't go around correcting people. I don't think it offended him. So if you call him Louis, I'm not mad at you. But if you hear me call him Louis, that's where I'm coming from.
All right. Well, whatever his mama said, I guess is what I'll go with. Well, thank you for that opening clip. And we're going to talk about both of your jobs also as archivist and as keeper of archives for these incredible institutions. But I want to start just by talking about this book and why you chose this period, because in both of these texts, you're choosing very specific periods of Louis's career as a musician.
Yeah, in some ways, I almost feel like this period chose me. This this is not really what I set out to do. It's funny. Last week was kind of it's a bizarre sounding anniversary, but it was 25 years ago. In October 1995 is when I heard the music of Louis Armstrong for the first time, and it was his 1950s recordings, and it completely changed my life. There's no way to downplay it. And so I began reading all the books I could find about Armstrong, and I kept on running into this narrative that, sure, he was a genius in the 1920s, but the guy who did Hello, Dolly and What a Wonderful World, I mean, that guy was just a clown. He was a sellout. He was a buffoon. There's nothing there. What a waste of talent. And that was in major biographies on Armstrong. And I would read these books and I would shake my head. I was, in high school at the time saying, why is nobody paying attention to the last 25 years? So that's kind of how I got into this world. When I was at Rutgers, I wrote a master's thesis on those last 25 years. And the first book, What a Wonderful World, came out in 2011. And it literally begins at Town Hall in May 1947. And ends with his passing in 71. And when that book came out, I thought I was done. I said, that's the book I dreamed about for 15 years. And now it's out. And I've been able to live this charmed life of teaching and lecturing and running the archives and producing CDs and no complaints. But I would go out there and I would meet people, meet students, meet Armstrong fans, meet musicians. And I realized that they all knew the hot fives and hot sevens, the 1920s work. And now the 50s and 60s work, it's been rehabilitated to a point. People know the pop songs. They know the Ella Fitzgerald stuff, Oscar Peterson, Satchel Plays Fats. And there's so much meat there, but nobody knew what happened in between. The middle years were now kind of being subject to this kind of brush off. Well, he led a big band for many years. The band wasn't very good. Louis wasn't very popular. He made a series of bad movies, and the All Stars, he kind of rescued his career and ushered in the last chapter. And I said, well, wait a minute. Once again, people are missing the story. And so 1928 has always become like the defining year in Louis Armstrong's career. It's West End Blues, it's Earl Father Hines, it's The Innovator. And I said, all right, everyone agrees that 1928 is this peak of some sort. I'm going to begin a book right after it. I'm going to begin a book immediately after the start of 1929. All right, so you all think he's finished. Let's start there. And the bookends ended up being perfect. I couldn't have planned it better. I never envisioned writing it backwards like this. But starting the first book in 29 and ending it at Town Hall, and then my previous book beginning it at Town Hall and ending at the end, I never planned it, but I think it's kind of worked out in my favor. I'm having a lot of fun, that's for sure.
Well, it works out perfectly for us, because any excuse to do something with Brad, I was like, oh, so there's this book that's kind of about our institutions, or at least, no, but, something that I was wondering is, what kind of resources did you use to put this together? And did the research change, between researching for your first book and for this one?
Yeah, everything I had read about Armstrong was mostly critics and musicologists and jazz historians, and there's always some good ones. I'm not gonna just paint everybody with a wide swath. The jazz world is awful. Yeah, God bless Dan Morgenstern and Robert O'Meally and Stanley Crouch and Gary Giddens. A lot of people got it, but I would read all that stuff and it would drive me crazy. And I said, Louis needs to speak for himself, and the musicians need to speak for themselves. So my first book, I was lucky. There were still 5 surviving members of the All Stars. I interviewed them all at length. But that book really relied on Armstrong's own words, because in 1950, he gets his first tape recorder. Between that moment and the night before he passes away in 71, he makes hundreds, almost 1,000 reel-to-reel tapes, and we have 750 of those tapes at the Armstrong archives, and about half of them are spoken word. Armstrong talking about music, about race, about women, about life, and so that was really the first book. I used the jazz press, and New York Times and stuff like that, but I wanted the musicians, the sidemen, and Louis himself to carry the load. And so for this book, it was mostly the same. But the big change in the 9 years was that the world has become digitized. And so without barely leaving my home, I was able to access every issue of Variety, every issue of Billboard, the Black Press, all the newspapers, newspapers.com, and everything on ProQuest, the music trades, the radio trades, all that kind of stuff. And it was harder with the musicians in this period because they're all gone. But God bless again, the Smithsonian and the Institute of Jazz Studies did a very extensive oral history project in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I got a grant to do some research at the Institute of Jazz Studies, and I was able to resurrect the words of Charlie Holmes and Pops Foster and, all these musicians who were there, Zutty Singleton. And so it became a broader picture, I think. The musicians are there. Louis is still the prime voice, but I really wanted to get the voices of the Black press and also the jazz press, just to show how Armstrong was being covered in this period. So I'm kind of there connecting the dots and telling the stories. And, there's obviously some themes that really, are prevalent. But I didn't rely on any other Armstrong biographies for writing this book. I know them all backwards. I might have grabbed a quote or two from a few, but I didn't even want to pick them up. I wanted all the research to be fresh, contemporary portraits of how it happened.
Well, that's it. So, this comes up with you, Brad, too, just being able to access so much digitally, and first of all, that's made our role somewhat easier over the last 7 months, but also how that's where everything is shifting right now. Could you speak to that a little bit for you at the Apollo?
Right, and I mean, we're at the Apollo. The archives program is relatively new. I've been there about almost 3 years now, and I was the first full-time staff archivist there. And I like to think that we're gathering, digitizing, cataloging, and making accessible the sort of material that will enable the kind of research that Ricky and other scholars are doing. So what we try and do with digitization is not only to make stuff accessible, which is the great thing about a digital collection, is that you can, once it's online, it's easy to find. You don't have to travel. But it's also a preservation measure. I mean, the Apollo's been open since 1934. We've been putting ads in the newspapers since then, but those old pulpy newspapers are turning to dust. But if you can do good high-res scans, you're preserving them, for generations, hopefully. So that's that's where we're at right now at the Apollo. Our collection is not accessible to the public just yet. We're still working on it. But if folks have any questions, or we're happy to help fans, researchers, anyone. We'll put our email address up in a little bit.
Wonderful. Well, before we move on to more of the meat of the conversation, I was wondering if you both could talk about a little bit more about your roles, starting with you, Ricky. Can you tell us about the Louis Armstrong House Museum?
Yeah, it's an inauspicious day today. Today's my 11th anniversary of my first day on the job in 2009. It's the only job I'm qualified to do, so I'm very, very lucky I fell into it. The Louis Armstrong House Museum, the main operation, it's the home where Louis Armstrong lived with his wife, Lucille. There it is there. They purchased that home in 1943. Louis lived there the last 20 years of his life. Lucille passed away in 1983. But in her widowhood, she had it declared a National Historic Landmark. She saved all of Louis's archival materials. And her goal was always to turn it into a museum. She died suddenly, left the house in her will to the city of New York. The city of New York kicked it over to Queens College. The Louis Armstrong Educational Foundation donated all of the Armstrong personal archival materials. And so the archives opened up to the public in 1994. That's at Queens College. And the House Museum opened up in 2003. So my domain, that's the archives, before the whole working from home life. I would go to Queens College every day, and it's become the world's largest archives for any single jazz musician. We have 13 separate collections just devoted to Armstrong. The core collection is Lewis's stuff. I mentioned the tapes. I mentioned his scrapbooks, his manuscripts, everything I've been using also for my research. It's all there. But all these major collections. And the photo you see right there, it's myself and our old archivist, Sarah Rose. We're holding I think it's a 4 terabyte hard drive because in 2016, we got a $2.7 million grant from Robert F. Smith, the wealthiest African American on the planet. He gave us a grant specifically to digitize our entire collection and make it accessible. And it was a whirlwind process, but we managed to scan every photo and every scrapbook page and digitized all the tapes and films and photographs and sheet music and big band arrangements and records and you name it. And it's all online. You can go to collections.louisarmstronghouse.org and you can create an account. It's a free account. And while you're there, it's the exact same experience you get if you come out to the college. You can't download everything for free and make a personal stash, but you can listen to watermarked versions of the tapes and read the scrapbooks and go through pretty much everything we have there. And it's been a wild thing. Just speaking of the pandemic, because we closed on this date 7 months ago. March 13th was the day the world kind of stopped. And for a minute there, we all said, well, what do we do? And we realized that we had this digitized archives and everything's in the cloud. I can get to it at any time. And so myself and the staff, we put together a series of virtual exhibits. And we called it That's My Home, because we figured that everybody's stuck at home. And the overarching theme is, what did Louis Armstrong do when he was at home? Make tapes and have conversations. And so we started in April, just kind of throwing it out there in the middle of like the height of the news coverage with the pandemic. And people responded. The Washington Post did a big spread and all this stuff. And so this has kept me going. We've done about over 50 of these posts exploring every theme we could think of. Louis in Queens, the story of Lucille, Louis during the Civil Rights era. We were going tape by tape, going scrapbook by scrapbook, going page by page with me kind of annotating everything. And we've gotten a beautiful response. And so it's the kind of thing I always make sure I lead by saying, I wish there was no pandemic. I wish I was in Queens. I wish none of this ever happened the last 7 months. But as far as silver linings go, we've been able, because of the digitized collection, to continue working, to continue assisting researchers, putting rarities up on social media every day, and curating these virtual exhibits on the That's My Home site. That URL is virtualexhibits.louisarmstronghouse.org. And we have a big series coming up on Louis and comedy, which I think some of our viewers will like to check out when that's ready.
That's great. Well, Brad, one thing I'm definitely jealous of is your storage space. Or even, your office as well that I got to see. But yeah, I love this image of you.
Yeah, that's me in the stacks. That was a day over 2 days. We digitized about 2,200 historic photos that were in the theater's collection, and you'll be seeing some later in the presentation tonight. Any of the photos that are hand tinted, that's what we were working on, and we just had an assembly line going, passing them under a scanner, and yeah, they were long days, but we made incredible transfers that we use all the time in our marketing and our social media and our education programs. It was a really, really productive day, and I don't look too tired in that photo, but that was at the start of it.
Well, one thing I want to just show back to back are screenshots of what the back end of digital archiving, and I promise we'll get to the content, but for anybody who's interested, this is the nerdy side of archiving. This is what the back end looks like. So, shout out to every digital archivist who does this work so that you can see the front end. And also, if you have any questions, we'll make sure you have, contact info for some of these great people. Yes, so let's move on to our main topic, which is, of course, Apollo to Town Hall, back to the Apollo, this particular period. And let's start at 29. So where was Louis Armstrong in 1929? Who was in his band? Tell us about where he was.
There he is right there. He used to refer to that as his movie star pose. That was one of his big publicity photos from 1929. As I mentioned earlier, 28 in the jazz world is like this peak of innovation and the records he made, but he was actually just a sideman in Chicago. He was in, Carol Dickerson's orchestra. He was, very well featured. He was very popular in Chicago. And the Hot Fives and Hot Sevens were made, they were known as race records. They were aimed at the African American community. And they were popular, but pretty much as far from pop music as you could get. They had that trumpet, trombone, clarinet, banjo setup that was already fairly out of date by 1928. But anything Armstrong did, managed to get an audience. And so OK Records had an A&R man named Tommy Rockwell. And Rockwell was in charge of overseeing OK's pop label. And he was the one who really formulated the blueprint of Armstrong's future success, that there's the race market, but then there's the pop market. And what if we take Armstrong off of the race record series, put him on the pop series, and we're going to give him the same love songs, the same Tin Pan Alley songs that all the white crooners are doing, and even his big band, it's going to have the same kind of Guy Lombardo sound with the saxophone section. Most of these records, when Louis is not playing or singing, they sound like a 1929 dance band. And I think that was the point. But Rockwell knew that Armstrong was bringing something different to the table. His spirit of innovation, of improvisation, just his, undeniable, unapologetic, African American sensibilities, scatting, slang, everything he put in these records. They would come out at the same time as the white records. And once you heard him do Ain't Misbehaving, and you heard, a white crooner do it, or once you heard Louis do I'm Confessing That I Love You, or If I Could Be With You 1 Hour Tonight, or Stardust, or All of Me, or When You're Smiling, it's basically the Great American Songbook that he is establishing in this period. And it works. By 1931, at the start of 1932, they announced that Louis Armstrong was the biggest selling artist in the record industry. And this is during the Great Depression. This is an African American artist. Variety would put out these charts, and the rest of the charts, it's not the jazz names that we know and love from this period. There might be a scattering of Duke Ellington records, but it's it's Ruth Etting and Gene Austin and Guy Lombardo and these pop artists. And there's Louis Armstrong. He's on the top of every chart. And so he has incredible success, but in his offstage life, he's plagued by managerial issues. He had a manager after Rockwell, a guy named Johnny Collins muscles in, and Collins, I've heard from multiple people, kind of quickly establishes himself as one of the villains of the story. He's not all bad, because he gets Armstrong to this next level. He gets him an incredible RCA Victor contract. He gets him in the movies, but he's pretty bad. And so by breaking contracts and threatening people, he gets Armstrong into hot water with gangsters, to the point where Armstrong is being held at gunpoint. Armstrong is arrested. There's all this craziness. And so in 32, they actually go to England for the first time, just to kind of lay low for a little bit. But then in 33, that's Armstrong surrounded by all white musicians. The musicians in England loved him. The dance band critics and jazz writers didn't quite know what to make of him. Some of the jazz writers loved his records, but they weren't ready for the showmanship. They would see the smile, see him running up and down the stage, bouncing, sweating. And they, some of the most racist reviews, comparing him to apes and the jungle stuff. And this horrific stuff all happened overseas in the early 30s. But then in 33, he gets in a major fight with Collins, and he decides to go to Europe and stay in Europe. And while he's over there, he starts battling all sorts of troubles with his chops. And his career kind of hits rock bottom in the end of 34, where he's got no manager and his chops are shot, and he decides to come back home. And that's where the whole saga begins, with the resurgence, the part two, the comeback of Louis Armstrong. But that whole 29 to 34 period, it's fascinating. I didn't prep this in advance, but maybe we could throw it in the chat later. I put together a 10-hour Spotify playlist of just about every single recording Armstrong made between 29 and 34. And I could just put that there and say, there, have at it. It's Louis Armstrong. He's great. But for the context, I surrounded each one with 3 or 4 contemporary versions. Brad's got 3 or 4 contemporary versions of each song, and they're wild because almost all the bands are white bands, and a lot of them are playing the same arrangement. So you actually hear these like snatches coming back and forth, but then you hear what he does with it. And to me, it's the greatest illustration of his genius. You can listen to the 1920 stuff and get it just, there it is. It's undeniable. But when you hear what else was happening in the world, the pop music world, and you hear what he was doing, then it just makes it that much greater. So we could throw up the link later, but the Spotify playlist is called Louis Armstrong in Context, 1929 to 34. And it's public, and a lot of people have been responding to it. So definitely check it out.
Before we leave Europe, let's watch a video.
Ladies and gentlemen, the next number we're going to swing for you is one of the good old favorites. That's Dinah. Look out there, boy. Are you ready? Look out. Anyone finer in the state of Carolina? If there is, then you know, show to me. Dinah, the Dixon blazing, who love the city gazing to the eyes of Dinah me. Baby, every night while I shake with fine palm, cause my dynamite change your mind. Baba, did you want to Dinah, baby? I'll have a new line, oh, baby. Oh, Dinah.
No further questions, Your Honor. But that's interesting. That's October 1933, and he goes back to Europe for the second time in July of 33, and this is where the critics really turn on him. The first headline in Melody Maker in July of 33 is frenzy over Armstrong. Armstrong deliberately all commercial. Frenzy for meaningless performance. And it's wild that clip we just watched has become like the gold standard. Everybody, Ken Burns, they all point to that clip as there he is, the young Louis Armstrong at the height of his powers. But like in that moment, the critics were already sharpening the knives that, he's deliberately all commercial and he's already, lost it as compared to what he was doing a few years ago. So it's wild. But God bless the Danes for capturing it, because he had already made a few Hollywood shorts in which they threw every racist stereotype imaginable at him. But when he got to Copenhagen, the Danes were just like, do what you do on stage every night. And so Louis and his band got to go on stage. They got to wear their tuxedos. They played 3 numbers. And, the film wasn't rediscovered until after Louis passed away. But now it's, like I said, check out the whole 1930 3-minute sequence on YouTube. It's a 9-minute clip. But just to capture him like that, what he was doing night in and night out, it's unbelievable.
That's incredible. But he comes back to the U.S. He comes back. He doesn't have management, right?
Well, yeah, this is the rock bottom moment of his career. He comes back to New York, and he leaves Europe. He had a manager, and he just leaves the manager overnight. The manager, he left his music trunk with him, so he comes back to America with no arrangements, with no manager, with no band, with no record contract, with no lips. The doctor said he couldn't play for 6 months. His second wife, Lil, was suing him. And Johnny Collins, the aforementioned manager, was waiting for him. And immediately, as soon as Armstrong arrives back in America, he makes a beeline for the Apollo. And he doesn't play, but he showed up, and there was a sensation. People couldn't believe he was back. No one knew he was coming back. And so that's when Johnny Collins steps forward and goes, "I'm still Louis Armstrong's manager, and he's going to play the Apollo in 2 weeks, and he'll be there." And Armstrong doesn't. He goes back to Chicago, and he stays there for the next 5 or 6 months. And just, the way the name of the chapter in my book is "What the hell has happened to Louis Armstrong?" Because Armstrong said that's what all the Chicago press, that's what they were wondering. They're like, where is he? He came back. And it's if this was a Rocky movie, this would be the training montage. That's for you, Brad. Where Armstrong is he's basically learning how to play the trumpet over again. He had a trumpeter named Zilner Randolph teaching him, going back to beginner's method books, hitting whole notes and the whole thing. But we had a question in the comments: who was his manager after Johnny Collins? Armstrong ends up hiring a man named Joe Glazer, and we could have done 2 hours on Joe Glazer. Joe Glazer is kind of like the second, maybe most important character, you could say, in the book. Comes from an incredibly checkered past, gangster connections, multiple allegations for rape, you name it. Al Capone, fixing boxing matches, gets arrested multiple times, running whorehouses. But in the 20s, he ran the Sunset Cafe, and he took a liking to Armstrong, and he billed him as the world's greatest trumpet player. And so Armstrong remembered that. And he remembered the night that another gangster came up to Glazer and said, "Why do you call him the world's greatest trumpet player?" And Glazer said, "Listen, this is my joint, and I think he's the world's greatest trumpet player, and I defy anybody else to tell me otherwise." And Louis always remembered that. So when he's at this rock bottom moment in his career, he goes to Joe Glazer, who's also at a rock bottom moment. He had prohibition, and it ended. Glazer, as I mentioned, he'd been arrested, but he'd been set free. But he was still getting arrested right up to the last minute. With illegal alcohol and stealing and all this horrible stuff. But Louis finds Glazer and goes, "Listen, you're the only one who can get me out of this." And Glazer was not a booking agent, but Louis knew the way he phrased it was he needed a gangster to play ball with a gangster. And so within weeks, Glazer basically put up, whatever he had left, and he hawked Sunset Cafe, whatever he could just to get some money. And he got Zilner Randolph to put together a band, and he bought out Johnny Collins' contract and got Armstrong back on the road. And by the end of 1935, Louis is breaking records at the Apollo, which we'll talk about. He's recording for Decca. He's fronting Louis Russell's orchestra. He's headlining a revue on Broadway. He's appearing on all the radio shows. He's featured in Esquire. He's featured in Vanity Fair. And for that and that reason alone, for the rest of his life, you could not say a negative word about Joe Glazer in Louis Armstrong's presence. Friends such as Jack Bradley told me stories, his wife Lucille. Nobody could even hint about anything remotely negative about Glazer, or Armstrong would launch into profanity like you would never believe. And people have debated this for 80 years. Well, it's the old trope. The white gangster manager is sitting in the office counting money while the black genius is out there busting his lips every night. But it's deeper than that, because Glazer did, he watched Armstrong's money, but he paid for the band. He did all the booking, he did all the hiring and firing, he paid Armstrong's taxes, he made sure he had money, whatever he needed. Armstrong got a weekly salary, but there's numerous letters where Armstrong would just write to Glazer and say, hey, I need $5,000, and Glazer would send it to him. And some multiple musicians, African-American musicians in the 1970s were questioned. Clark Terry, Ray Nance, they're saying, what about this relationship of Louis Armstrong and Joe Glazer? And they all said that they would have killed to have a relationship like that, because for the last 36 years of his life, Armstrong had to worry about nothing but playing the trumpet. Nothing else mattered. He didn't have to worry about the business or taxes or anything else, or where his next check was going to come from. He just had to show up and play the trumpet, and life was a party. And he died a millionaire, and Joe Glazer died a millionaire. And so it's a weird kind of thing where we can pick it apart. And from a society standpoint, it's unfortunate that Louis needed a figure like that to kind of get him out of there. But for what it's worth, the relationship worked. It really did for both of them. And so the book paints a very deep portrait of a very complex relationship, but Glazer's the guy really responsible for the comeback.
Wow. And he comes back. Wow, that's a lot. But he comes back with the intention to come back to the Apollo. And
yes.
And I want to talk about where the Apollo was in 1935. So, Brad, if you wouldn't mind taking us, well, actually, we've got some good questions. We're going to leave some of these towards the end, especially the ones about the 60s and such. But can you take us to the Apollo 125th, 1935?
Sure. The Armstrong comes to the Apollo in August of 35. By then, the theater's been open as the Apollo for about a year and a half. It opened under the Apollo name with Benny Carter Orchestra headlining in January 1934. As an archivist, you want to find all the business records and the sources, but a lot of this history we've sort of had to reclaim because the Apollo was a working theater from day one. They were too busy, or they were very busy keeping the seats full and keeping everybody paid, so they weren't always saving every little scrap of paper. So this is what, as archivists, we're going back and trying to reassemble the picture using, a lot of articles from the black press, newspaper ads and such. So the Apollo's up and running for about a year and a half. As Ricky talks about in the book, it's up on the vaudeville model, so 3 to 5 shows a day. When you went to a show at the Apollo, you saw an orchestra, you saw comedians, you saw singers, you saw animal acts and acrobats and ventriloquists. Nobody was on the stage for too long. It was a constant shifting vaudeville model. And since Harlem at the time was changing, the operators of the Apollo, Sidney Cohen, Frank Schiffman, and Leo Brecker, they were catering to the growing African-American population in Harlem by focusing on African-American talent, and the hall was also integrated. There were, unlike a lot of other venues, there were African-Americans on stage and in the audience. And looking back on that first year, if we're looking for names we'd recognize today, in the first year and a half, performers like the blues singer Bessie Smith, Jackie Moms Mabley and Pygmy Markham, the comedians, famous dancers like Bill Bailey and Snake Hips Tucker, Bojangle. There's Moms. Bojangles Robinson. And they also hosted jazz orchestras, Duke Ellington, Eddie South, the white saxophonist Charlie Barnett, people like Fletcher Henderson and Louis Russell, who...
That's Schiffman, right?
That's Frank Schiffman there. Okay. Yep, he and his family ran the theater up through the 70s. And yeah, people like Louis Russell and Fletcher Henderson, who Armstrong was about to work with or had previously worked with. And even Armstrong's second wife, and I guess current wife on paper at the time, Lil Armstrong, played the Apollo, and definitely used his name in the marketing materials. Definitely drummed up business that way. Also, at this time, the amateur night on Wednesday was already up and running, which we continue to do to this day. It's hard to say the box office receipts are long lost, but jazz was clearly a hit at the Apollo. The vocalist and band leader Willie Bryant, who's another Joe Glazer client, I believe, or became one, he was held over for 3 weeks in '34, doing a very charismatic, very hip kind of jazz with a lot of winking, sort of coded comedy messages. You can hear his stuff on YouTube. So that's where the theater's at the moment. It's primed, but I don't know if a star of that magnitude had really graced the stage yet. Harlem, loved Armstrong, and Armstrong loved Harlem, but he hadn't been around in a while. So
yeah. It also is interesting that it comes from this, or it has this variety history, considering that it was once a burlesque theater, which I did not know until like a few years ago.
That's true. Yeah, it was built in 1913, 1914, and opened as Hertig and Siemens' new burlesque house back under the original management. There's a season pass from the old burlesque days. But, burlesque had kind of fallen onto the wrong side of the law by then. It was LaGuardia and his police chief had started shuttering burlesque houses. And so while Armstrong hadn't played the Apollo by 35, he knew the Apollo management, Brecker and Schiffman, because they ran the Lafayette Theater uptown at 132nd and 7th Avenue. They ran that and booked it along similar lines as a showcase for African-American talent for African-American audiences. But the action in Harlem was moving down to 125th Street. And so they, Brecker and Schiffman, started booking shows at the Harlem Opera House, which is down the street from the Apollo. I think it's an office building now. And eventually, having two theaters doing the same kind of programming, the Apollo and the Opera House, they were kind of cannibalizing one another. So Brecker and Schiffman joined up with Sidney Cohen and focused on the Apollo. And I think you might mention this in the book. Sidney Cohen was going to have the legendary A&R guy, music writer John Hammond book the Apollo, and I think he had started to set that in motion, and then Sidney Cohen passed away suddenly, and so Brecker and Schiffman really took over the booking. But Hammond features in a lot of Ricky's new book for his perspective on Armstrong that's kind of influenced the way it's contributed to the narrative that he was great until 1929, which I'm glad to see being disrupted and re-examined.
Well, I would love to talk about the anticipation of, Louis Armstrong coming to Harlem and coming to the Apollo. So what was the anticipation once the date was set, once folks knew to expect him?
Well, the first date was the February one. This is Johnny Collins went to the press and booked him, and they put the ads out, and they had the date. And Louis was in no shape to play. His chops were gone, but he never wanted to see Johnny Collins again as long as he lived. And so he didn't come, and he actually sent a doctor's note. And the Apollo had the doctor's note printed up and blown up, and they put it in the lobby, so they knew that they were covered. That don't get mad at him. Louis Armstrong can't play. There's an original clipping, Union Trouble and Sore Lip Blame. That's pretty much it. So Louis, I think he kind of felt bad. I know he felt bad. There you go. New York turns out to see Louis Armstrong at Apollo Theater. He stays in Chicago. And so there's all this drama's playing out in the black press of, the fans came for Louis Armstrong. One writer, I forget what newspaper, was kind of irked that Armstrong didn't come. And I think he mentioned whatever act replaced him. It was like Chinese acrobats or a roller skating act or something like that. And he was like, well, they were better anyway. You know, the crowd really liked them, so nobody missed Arm. Yeah, there was this kind of personal thing. So when Armstrong hooks up a Glazer and goes back on the road, July 1st, 1935 is the beginning of this, like I said, the second part of his career. And the Apollo was booked for August 30th. And apparently in that span, July and August, they broke records in Washington at the Howard Theater, and they went back to New Orleans and played for black audiences down there. But Glazer was very savvy, and he realized that the black press could be an ally for him. So that he starts, whipping the papers into a frenzy, planting articles and photos. And so there are numerous articles in the weeks leading up to this August 1935 date. And that's actually where my book begins, because, you can imagine the anticipation. This guy had not recorded in America since April 1933. So that's 2.5 years pretty much. Every newspaper, there was a photo of him in Chicago Defender in May 35, and the headline was, "Is he through?" And so there's this whole thing of, are his lips shot, and his managers and gangsters, and we haven't heard him play, and all that stuff. And he goes to the Apollo and breaks the box office record and completely dominates. And the press coverage is just euphoric. That's a photo that was found in Lewis's collection. We don't know if he took it, if his girlfriend Alpha took it, if Joe Glazer took it, I don't know, but it was found in his collection, and that is the marquee at the Apollo for the August 1935 gig. So I think he knew this was important, that he had to show Harlem that he was back. And like I said, the reviewers, the black press was positively euphoric. They talked about how his showmanship had improved, and he opened with Ain't Misbehavin', which made him a star on Broadway in 29. And then the white press, Variety, Abel Green said he was better than ever before. And the biggest columnist at the time, Walter Winchell, saw Armstrong at the Apollo. And he used to give what he called New Yorkids instead of orchids. And he gave one of his New Yorkids to Armstrong at the Apollo. There he is with the big band at the Apollo there. And that made headlines in the black press, that Walter Winchell even approved of Armstrong at the Apollo. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that Armstrong's there the week of August 30th. And like I said, by October, he's headlining on Broadway and being featured in Vanity Fair. There's the Winchell article, being featured in Vanity Fair and Esquire and all these mainstream outlets. And apparently his comeback radio appearance was on Winchell's radio show in the first week of October 35. So the Apollo definitely opened up, I think, that avenue for this, reclaiming of his success, his pre-European sojourn, exile success.
And it's not just an amazing night or an amazing few gigs in 35, 36. It's an entire period of a lot of events at the Apollo. I mean, that becomes a major site for him over the next decade, right? Or longer.
Yeah, no, this is something that I wanted to set the record straight about. And I opened the book with the gloves off, kind of throwing down from the beginning, because Louis was inducted to the Apollo Walk of Fame in 2014. And I heard from someone who shall remain nameless, but they were like, why is Louis Armstrong being recognized by the Apollo? Like, he played there a handful of times. This is not the Museum for Black Music. This is the Apollo's Walk of Fame. And what's the deal? And it was writing my response to that email and going through the itinerary and pointing out how many times Armstrong played there. That was always in the back of my mind. And so when I started writing this book, I'm like, well, that's how I need to begin it. I need to reclaim this thing with the Apollo, because he returns in 36, breaks the box office record. He returns in 37 while he's at the height of this radio show, which we're going to talk about, the Fleischman's East show. I think he breaks the box office record in 40. There's incredible reviews in 42 and standing room only crowds in 45. And for Armstrong, I mean, before he moved to Queens, for a time, he lived at the Braddock Hotel, which was right across the street. And to hear him talk about it, even later in life, I think those nights at the Apollo were some of the happiest of his entire career. because Armstrong, of course, is a musical genius, but I honestly think he got along better with like comedians and entertainers and all that. And so for the rest of his life, he would talk about Swan and Lee and Patterson and Jackson and Pygmy and Mantan Moreland, all the comedians he shared the bill with. He thought they were some of the funniest people on the planet. And then, they would go back. He would say they would go spend long nights at the Braddock Hotel, signifying at the bar all night and, eating spaghetti in the morning and all this stuff. And there was something about him just being so beloved in Harlem, breaking box office records, the black press with him every step of the way. The Variety would send a reviewer every time he was at the Apollo, and he would get rave reviews. It's really only this slice of the jazz world that was just kind of holding its nose and saying, poor Louis Armstrong, what a failure. And again, that's what really inspired me, was to kind of dig into the way the press was covering him, just to show that these nights at the Apollo were just incredible moments for him in about a 17-year period.
Well, but this is what you call the jazz wars, right? This sort of war between critics, really, about what was valuable in jazz and what wasn't, what was hip, what was cheesy, what was entertainment, what was art. I mean, where did Louis fall in that debate, especially in the 40s and 50s?
Oh, the jazz wars really pick up steam in the 40s. And I didn't really set out to do this, but that kind of becomes like the theme of the second half of the book, because I wanted to explore how these wars kind of took off and how Armstrong was kind of in the middle of it and was seen as like the figurehead of every movement, but also made every movement unhappy. So he couldn't please everybody, couldn't please anybody, it seemed, at times. But what happened was, in 1939, a book came out called Jasmine, and it rediscovered Bunk Johnson, who was one of the pioneers, played with Buddy Bolden and King Oliver, and Louis remembered him when he was a kid. And Bunk Johnson had been working in the fields in New Iberia, Louisiana, and these three writers rediscovered him. They wrote a book, and they kind of turned him into a folk hero. And all of a sudden, there was this new vogue for old jazz, especially New Orleans jazz, because these people, the writers were almost exclusively white. There were a few African Americans. Frank Marshall Davis was probably the most prominent one. He became a mentor of Obama in Hawaii decades later, but who saw that jazz was really a folk music. And what became the swing era with the arrangements and the pop tunes and all that stuff was truly commercial, and that jazz was started with trumpet, trombone, and clarinet and the ensembles and all that stuff, and that's really the roots. And so there's swing going on with the big bands, but now there's this resurgence in New Orleans jazz. Okay. They obviously know that Louis Armstrong is one of their gods, but they also criticize him every step of the way because he's playing big band music every night, touring with a review. Meanwhile, World War II happens, and a lot of younger musicians become disenfranchised with the big band setup, playing arrangements every night. They go to the jam sessions, mostly in Harlem, Minton's, and they develop quote unquote modern jazz, bebop. And there's the recording ban, which no one knows really what's going on for a couple of years. But in 1945, bop starts, appearing out of the blue. Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, and all of a sudden they get their wing of quote unquote progressive critics. And so the gloves come off, and so the progressive critics take shots at the New Orleans fans, who quickly become known as the Moldy Figs, which is a whole other story. So the Moldy Figs are supposedly reactionary, trying to keep jazz back in its past, but the progressive critics are, jazz is modern, we're moving to the 21st century. Then there's the swing fans, who are still fighting for the big bands, Duke Ellington and Count Basie, and it gets ugly. And so Armstrong is definitely the man in the middle. And it's a weird place for him to be, because he loves New Orleans music and the music of his youth, but he has no interest in playing it again. In 1945, he gives an interview saying that people say that they should omit arrangements. He goes, well, I say omit those people. And he says, the stuff that he played in New Orleans, and he said, I could play that with one finger now, because you have to move forward. So that, of course, angered the New Orleans fans. But with modern jazz, Armstrong is a disciple to melody, and he always said that he was playing bebop in 1918, fast fingers and the whole thing. And so he would hear some of these jam sessions with solos going on for 5 or 6 minutes, and nobody would play the melody. They would just play on the changes. And in that same 1945 interview, he said, you'll never have to worry about me playing that style. And he encouraged modern musicians. He hired Charles Mingus. He hired Kenny Clarke for the big band. He hired Dexter Gordon. I know Maxine Gordon's watching right now. Hello, Maxine. He hired these young musicians, and he encouraged them. But he was never going to be a bopper. He had no interest. He talked about it. That was musicians playing for other musicians. And so it's this thing where the wars are heating up, and everybody's trying to claim Louis Armstrong. And I don't want to give away the ending, because I think Town Hall, gives us the ending and shows Armstrong's choice. So we'll save the culmination of the jazz wars. But it's a weird mix. And the moral of the story is it's the end of jazz as America's popular music. Most pop music fans gravitate towards the crooners. They want to hear Frank Sinatra. They want to hear ballads and love songs and World War II songs of loss and love and everything else. And most African American fans want to dance. They want to go to rhythm and blues and Louis Jordan and that kind of music. And while the moldy figs are battling the progressive critics, the rest of the world's like, see ya. And that's where we've been for the last 70 years, trying to get some attention.
Well, I mean, during this period, he signed with Decca, right?
Yeah, so Decca was a major label. They had Bing Crosby, who was basically the biggest star on the planet at the time. But Decca was run by a man named Jack Kapp, and Jack Kapp's method was, the melody had to be prominent. He had a photograph of a Native American standing with her one hand over her eyes and her other hand held out. And there was a thought bubble that said, "Where's the melody?" And that was planted in the recording studio. So all the Decca artists had to stare at that and make sure that the melody was always first and foremost. And he also didn't want his artists sticking to one genre. So when you look at the Bing Crosby discography, Bing's recording cowboy songs and Hawaiian songs and love songs and jazz songs, Armstrong goes down the same route. And now, to me and other like-minded fans, this Decca period is tremendous. Again, if you already have the Spotify queued up, there's a release called the Decca Singles, 1935 to 46. You will hear Armstrong with his big band, with Louis Russell's big band, but you will also hear him do Hawaiian songs. You'll hear him with the Mills Brothers. You'll hear him reunite with Sidney Bechet. You'll hear him do Burt Williams monologues and sing spirituals. And to me, this is like him showing that he is one of the greatest all-around entertainers imaginable. No style, no genre could keep him down. He's always 100% real, always 100% Louis Armstrong. And these are the recordings that the jazz press gets positively suicidal about. Like, hearing Louis do Hawaiian music, they're like, "Oh, the tragedy of Louis Armstrong." And I love those Hawaiian sides. So, to each his own. But the Decca records, check them out. They're probably the most undervalued period of Armstrong's career, but I think that's changing. I think a lot of people are checking them out and realizing that this variety of material, it's genius to put this guy in all these different settings.
Well, I mean, he's talking about a career that spanned a lot. He was in a lot of films for a musician. And I think we both agree that the sort of later years, 50s on, are much more watchable. I mean, he's not in this photo, but Cabin in the Sky, definitely more watchable than most from the 40s. But there are others as well. But it's interesting that for the most part, and this happens with, I know with a lot of Lena Horne's earlier films, is that the performances of the musical performances of Black musicians or actors can actually be cut out, and the film will still make sense, so that it can be shown in the South. But yeah, tell us a little bit about some of these films and how you at the Louis Armstrong, House Museum sort of reckon with these depictions, especially the films in the first 30 years of his, career.
Yeah, no, this becomes again another major secondary theme of the book, because I had read all the 21st century takes on these films, and I have my own 21st century brain, and I realized that watching these with the 21st century lens, yeah, they definitely make us squirm and say poor Louis Armstrong. Did he have to take a role as a garbage man or a chicken thief, and did he have to get these terrible jokes, and what a horrible thing. But again, why I wrote this book, doing the research, I wanted to get into that world. Like, what did it mean in 1936? Let's erase our 21st century lens. We know how we feel about it. What did it mean to African Americans in the 30s? And this was an eye opener, because for the most part, they were with him. These films like Pennies from Heaven, there was an African American writer, Bernice Patton, for the Pittsburgh Courier. She was on the set, and she wrote to the Pittsburgh Courier readers saying that, I am watching Louis Armstrong's film, and it is a great role, and we should be very proud and thank Hollywood. And then, he makes this movie Going Places, which people always hold up because he sings Jeepers Creepers to a horse. And again, Earl Morris and the Pittsburgh Courier, please write to Warner Brothers and thank him for the great part they gave Louis Armstrong and Maxine Sullivan and the Dandridge sisters. And we might have a few more of these. And then there's Louis himself, who 100% of the time never apologized for this kind of stuff. He wrote letters in 1938 while he was making Going Places. I just love to do comedy for these motion picture stars. I think he did view himself as a comedian. I mean, Cabin in the Sky, they cut his musical number. You hear a few notes of trumpet, but his entire scene is comedic. And he bragged about that scene for the rest of his life, that his lines saved the scene, and that he was in there with all these high-powered actors and comedians, and that all the critics talked about was how funny he was. And so he wore it with a badge of honor. But I think one of the more fascinating things I found was a public debate in the pages of the New York Age between two writers. One, Alfred Duckett, who became a friend of Martin Luther King and co-wrote some of his speeches. And Duckett is praising Armstrong's role in Pennies from Heaven. And that was the first time an African-American ever got featured billing in a Hollywood film. So it's a major thing on that level. But he praises the role. He goes, it's funny. Louis himself said it was the biggest laugh in the picture. And he plays trumpet, and the audience I saw it with applauded, and it was great. But then there was a young writer, I'm blanking on her name, or a female writer for the American Negro Press. She said, there's these jokes about being a chicken thief, and he doesn't know how to do math, and is this really progress? And they got into a debate, like a 4-column debate in the pages of the New York Age. And I quote heavily from both of them, and really they're both right, but it's wild seeing these kinds of things take place, because, it's just this struggle for identity, and it's too easy sometimes to think an entire race of people must all feel the same way. We still see it today. People arguing, Spike Lee versus Tyler Perry. Why are these movies popular with African American? We don't understand this and that. And that was happening back then, where it's funny. Just bring it back to the Apollo for a minute. I found an article from 1945 where Louis shared the stage with Butterbeans and Susie, and Butterbeans and Susie did a joke saying that one of them was Frank Sinatra in Technicolor, and a white guy from Brooklyn wrote a letter to the black press saying, I am a liberal white man, but I was very uncomfortable by that joke. And the whole theater was screaming with laughter. And I don't understand, if you're complaining about getting better parts in pictures, how can you demean yourself with these jokes? And so it gets to all these issues where, sometimes sensitivity and guilt, and it's just like, this is making me squirm. This can't be good. But then you look at Louis and you look at the black press at the time, and even to this day, I mean, Archie Shepp gave an interview last month. Again, Maxine Gordon sent it to me on Desert Island Disc, saying that Louis Armstrong was the only black person they saw in the movies back then. And they used to go to these movies and wait for him and applaud, and they couldn't wait to see him on screen. So sometimes, we get so wrapped up in the 21st century thinking that you have to put the context and put yourself in that position of what it must have been like. And, we can still squirm and we can still look down and realize that these were missed opportunities compared to the Danish footage of just here's Louis Armstrong. But at the time, I think they were very important to a lot of people and kind of getting Armstrong and his music seen by a wider audience. Though, like you said, not exactly a Southern audience, as they usually cut his scenes out. So
yeah, that's what I think. Much, yeah. It's interesting to watch some of those films, especially the more like That's Entertainment, or not That's Entertainment in particular, but those sort of variety-esque That's Entertainment like musical films where you could just cut something out and find out that oftentimes that is exactly what happened to a number that had African Americans in it. But so we're talking about that, but I would love to play an excerpt from a radio show that Louis did during this period.
Fleischmann's Yeast presents Harlem. The makers of Fleischmann's Yeast bring you another fast and furious program featuring music by Louis Armstrong, the trumpet king of swing, comedy by Eddie Green and G.G. James, with words by octavist Roy Cohen. And now, the head gate himself, Louis Armstrong and his orchestra.
Now look here, got no shoes on my feet. I ain't got nothing to eat, but I've got a heart full of rhythm. Not a dime to my name, but I'm rich just the same. I've got a heart full of rhythm. When the skies look gray and everything's wrong, I find my way by singing a song. Let the great think I'm small. Boy, I can laugh at them all. Ha! I've got a heart full of rhythm. Look at you. Now, folks, this is old Satchel Mouth swinging at you, playing one of them old good ones he wrote himself. A heart full of rhythm, yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Man.
I love that so much. You know, as we talk about the jazz wars and the changing of the guard, really, I would love to talk a little about Dizzy. He's important to the town hall history, but I know, Brad, that he's a great example of the changing tide at the Apollo. And I wonder if we could just talk a little bit about how his performance style changed at the Apollo.
That's that is interesting because bebop is thought of as this sort of inward-looking, as Ricky said, musicians playing for other musicians. But I mean, bebop for a while did well at the Apollo. They hosted a lot of bebop performers, Dizzy among them. Charlie Parker played there 3 or 4 times between 48 and 51. He played with his Charlie Parker with Strings Ensemble there, and that was actually very well received by the audience and the management, which people still fight about the Charlie Parker with Strings records to this day, which they're fantastic, but people also saw them as a sign of commercialization, the same charge leveled at Louis Armstrong. Gillespie was certainly the Apollo audience is legendary for being very vocal and letting you know how they feel. And I think Dizzy emerged from his many shows at the Apollo, which you can see on the last image of the booking card. He emerged more fully formed as an entertainer while also maintaining his high level of musicianship. On the screen now, you see one of the booking cards, which is from a collection that we share with the Smithsonian. Frank Schiffman would take notes on every performer who came through, and you can see the date they played, how much they were paid, a little bit of, he would put some notes in there about whether the audience liked them or if they were cooperative. You can see the 1950 show. It says augmented to play this show. So he probably added musicians, but it says no good. That's all it said. 51 did not do a good job either playing the show or the specialties. Specialties, I think, meaning, the comedic bits or the more showbiz parts. Mm-hmm. As it goes up, 52, better than before, small band specialty, good. But then 53 came in not too well prepared. So, bebop, the lifestyle and the performance style, it's very, it's driven by improvisation. It's in the moment, and the Apollo, Frank Schiffman was looking for somebody who could deliver every time. So it's a little tricky, but bebop at the Apollo has a strong legacy. I mean, Betty Carter, who's one of the most out there vocalists, at least up until the 60s, always did very well at the Apollo. Of course, as her music became more exploratory and progressive, she was not as well received. I mean, by the 50s and 60s, the Apollo, the jazz that was doing well was the cooler stuff. Miles Davis, also the Latin-tinged Cal Tjader or Herbie Mann. There were all the Latin musicians did well, but Ramsey Lewis, the more soul-inflected jazz, did very well at the Apollo. So that kind of segues, I guess, into how Louis Armstrong can continue to play the Apollo up to a certain point, and then just the booking, they just stopped booking him entirely.
Yeah, and I think about Dizzy in the context of the Town Hall and the Apollo, because we've talked about this a lot, artists who played both spaces but played them differently. So, for example, Louis Armstrong being on a large bill, oftentimes that was the case, people being on a large bill up at the Apollo and then coming to the Town Hall, being on a smaller bill, but also not having a comedian necessarily, definitely not having a dance act, not necessarily having that entertainment factor. So I don't know, we've talked about that a lot, about how different performers came and basically were different performers in these two spaces. So now that we're getting, to the actual performance and recording at Town Hall, I just want to give a little background on where Town Hall was in 1947. So, 1947, it's just after the war. And during the war, the Town Hall has so many political and social justice oriented events. First of all, the Town Hall since 1935 had been hosting America's Town Meeting of the Air, which is a weekly broadcast program where different civics or social or political issues be discussed every week. And guests like Fiorello LaGuardia, Eleanor Roosevelt, various senators, poets, even like Langston Hughes, or writers like Carl Sandburg and would go on and not debate, but discuss different issues. And this was basically a precursor to, Meet the Press, for example. But during the period from basically 35 till 45, so much of the programming, not just of that show, but also outside of that program, is around relief from the Great Depression, and also around war-related topics. So a lot of the 40s is organizing around the war. But I like to think of Town Hall's history as broken up into different periods musically. So, 1921, kind of tapering off in the 50s, but starting in 1921, classical music. But in the 40s, a lot of jazz comes to the hall, in particular bebop, although some big band as well. So it's just some things to think about. Is you mentioned Bunk Johnson. There's a great night where Bunk Johnson comes with Orson Welles, actually, and does a whole night of tracing jazz's history. So once again, it's this idea of like, we found this guy, and New Yorkers, right? New York sort of elite has decided that he's the jazz guy that we're all gonna look to as like a source. So him, and then Dizzy Gillespie is a mainstay at Town Hall and comes with partners. I mean, he comes with Dinah Washington. He has that incredible night with Chana Pozo. I think one of only 2 major gigs that they do. I think the other one is Carnegie. And then, of course, he records with Charlie Parker at the Town Hall, a recording that would not be released for decades. But also Sarah Vaughan and Count Basie record at the hall. And this is all before we even get to one of my favorite stories about jazz at Town Hall. There is beautifully young Sarah Vaughan. One of my favorite stories about jazz at Town Hall is, of course, Billie Holiday's solo debut. She had been at Town Hall before, but this concert, this solo concert, was set up for her, and she had never done a solo concert. In fact, many jazz singers hadn't. Jazz women singers, in particular, done a stand-up set that was split up into 2 written sets at a concert hall. And so they looked at jazz. They looked at leader sets, actually, for art song singers to put together a set list. And so they called it Jazz Leader, but she performed. And we have this photo that I actually could not. I found this on like a Dutch fan website and have not heard back yet about where they got this. But it was so sold out. Obviously, you can see they had to put on the stage. But that's giving you context. That's 46. So this is what's happening at the hall in terms of jazz, and a lot of it, of course, is big bands and bebop at the same time happening at the hall. And so we get to 47, and the hall is like ready for this man, and it's not really advertised well. At least for my findings. But Brad, I just wanted to, while we're both here, and these are every single artist that I've just mentioned is someone who's also been at the Apollo. The legacy of artists who have been at both, I think, is really interesting. And of course, we've talked a lot about Nina Simone. And, the fact that she was on a bill at the Apollo a few months later, at the bottom, a few months later was at Town Hall for her solo, and then came back at the top of the bill at the Apollo. Her, of course, Billie Holiday, having performed so many times at the Apollo.
Yeah, at least 23 weeks at the Apollo, Billie Holiday. But the difference is, as you were saying, it's one of sort of handing over the entire stage, the entire evening to the artist to cultivate a mood, to cultivate an atmosphere, which just wasn't possible at the Apollo's like fast-paced review style settings. Especially with somebody whose artwork was so personal as Nina Simone or Billie Holiday, there's only so much you could do with a 2 or 3 song spot in the middle of a show. And I mean, Billie Holiday didn't really jibe with the Schiffman management's. They wanted you to be on time. They wanted you to do your songs, win your audience over. And if you look at her booking card, which we don't have tonight, Billie Holiday was not a reliable performer given, the demons that she was dealing with her entire life. And Schiffman's card, is a pretty harsh reflection of that.
Mm.
But she could certainly, she had great nights and not so great nights, and those are reflected. But going to town hall, that gives you so much more to work with. I'd never heard the leader parallel, but that makes perfect sense.
Well, that's a whole other program we'll talk about. It's just like the Apollo and town hall boomerang. It's just,
Yes.
But something else that before we're going to talk about the event, but I think it's really important to talk about or to mention Eddie Condon, just because Eddie Condon is such a major part of town hall's history. There he is right there, a band leader and arranger, and he had a broadcast series from town hall and also, put an integrated band on stage. So, we'll be celebrating him as well as so many of the artists we just mentioned during our centennial. But important to mention Eddie Condon whenever we talk about jazz at town hall, and definitely when we're talking about an integrated band like the All Stars. So let's get to 1947. Oh, actually, before we get to 1947, quickly, can we just say something about Lucille? Quickly.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So the reason why we have a museum is because of that woman right there. That's Lucille Wilson. She was a Cotton Club dancer. Louis always called her a pioneer because she was the first dark-skinned dancer hired by the Cotton Club. They used to only hire light-skinned African Americans. So she was in show business. She's in the black press. They would always refer to her as brown sugar. But she finally danced in a review that Louis and Bill Robinson headlined in 1939. Louis was married to his third wife, Alpha, at the time, but they were already on the outs. And so Louis and Lucille began courting each other and eventually got married. Again, the anniversaries are swirling around. It was October 12th, 1942. So yesterday was the anniversary of their marriage. And their honeymoon, there's Lucille again from her dancing days. Their honeymoon was 6 straight months of one-nighters, and that's not what Lucille signed up for. So she actually found the home in Queens. She spent part of her childhood in Corona, Queens, and put the down payment on it and didn't even tell Louis. And so she moved her mother in, and eventually told him. And at first he kind of hit the ceiling, but once he took one look at it, he fell in love, and that's it. He never left that neighborhood for the rest of his life. So it took Louis, he always said, 4 times to get it right, but Lucille, that was true love right there. So there's their wedding day, October 12th, 1942, and there's Louis Russell on the left. So.
Wonderful. Well, we got to talk about her whenever we talk about her.
Yeah.
I feel like.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, okay. So let's get to town hall. He was continuing to perform at the Apollo when he came to New York, right? And he lived in New York. What was the New York set saying in advance of this show?
Well, this kind of came out of nowhere. 1945 kind of. It's just kind of like this bottom point for Armstrong. Not so much that he's unsuccessful, but he's mostly touring war bases, playing for troops. He makes 1 record that year. He's barely in the media. But that all changes in 46. He gets a new record contract through RCA Victor. They're really pushing his records a lot. He's still recording with the big band. He has a few high-profile New York engagements, one at the Aquarium. But the big shift is he's hired to make a movie in the summer of 1946 called New Orleans. Mm-hmm. And the movie initially is pitched as the story of jazz and the story of Louis Armstrong. But as weeks pass, they begin hiring more white actors and white actresses. And sure enough, by the time the movie came out, it was basically, this horrendous subplot with a love story. And, when jazz is discovered and finally debuts at Carnegie Hall at the end, it's a white band, Woody Herman's band on stage. So again, it's another one of those films that makes us squirm today. Billie Holiday is it plays a maid. So that's all you need to know. But at the time, again, I was shocked. The black press really put a lot of stock into this film. They said it was the first time, like, the story of jazz had really been told. It was the first time integrated characters were successfully shown on screen, and they were excited. And everybody praised Louis Armstrong, black and white, his acting, his comedic chops, and the music. And the music featured him back with a small group again, all the old New Orleans pioneers, Kid Ory on trombone, Barney Bigard on clarinet, and Zutty Singleton on drums, Bud Scott on guitar, Red Callender on bass, and Charlie Beale on piano. And never mind the romance and the subplot and all the garbage, real quick, the funniest review of New Orleans I've seen, I think it was an Amazon review, but somebody said, anytime you see a white person, hit fast forward, which accurately sums it up. But people couldn't get around the music. Yeah, the music was so good, and RCA Victor recorded the small group, and so now there was this kind of momentum. And at the beginning of 1947, again, there's been this kind of myth that Armstrong was just at like rock bottom again, but he had just won the Pittsburgh Courier poll, and he had just won the Esquire poll, where he hadn't placed in the previous years. So he was on the upswing, and it culminates in a concert at Carnegie Hall, his first time as a headliner in February 1947. And for that night, Leonard Feather was begging him to do the whole night with a small group. Louis wouldn't do it. He loved that big band so much. So he did the first half with a small group, Edmund Hall Sextet, and the second half with his big band. Billie Holiday was the guest vocalist. And of course, all anybody wanted to talk about was the small group half, seeing Louis Armstrong with the small group playing all the old Hot 5 and Hot 7 and New Orleans numbers. It just seemed so fresh, so new, so different, so compared to the big band. So you mentioned Eddie Condon. The Eddie Condon Town Hall series was produced by a man named Ernie Anderson. And Ernie Anderson was still booking a one-night stand series with the DJ Fred Robbins at Town Hall. And Ernie Anderson knew that Armstrong's big band was making about $350 for a weekday one-nighter. And so he went into Joe Glazer's office with a check for $1,000. And Joe Glazer saw the check and immediately started yelling and cursing at him. He goes, what is this all about? And Anderson goes, that's for one night at Town Hall for Louis Armstrong with a small group. And Glazer couldn't, turn down the money. He goes, fine, you got him, May 17th. And the band was actually, it's an Eddie Condon band without Eddie Condon. The entire band on stage that night, Bobby Hackett on cornet and Jack Teagarden on trombone, Peanuts Hucko on clarinet, Dick Carey on piano, and two drummers, Sid Catlett and George Wetling, and the bassist Bob Haggart. They're all Condonites. Yeah, that's all from the Condon circle. So it's basically a glorified Eddie Condon Town Hall concert without Condon, but with Armstrong in the leader spot. And they barely had any time to rehearse. Louis apparently showed up at the rehearsal, and they went over some songs and some keys. And he goes, all right, I'm going to go back home. You guys rehearse. And so Bobby Hackett had to rehearse the band. Louis went back to Corona for a few hours. And it was an 11:30 p.m. show. Town Hall actually had Segovia on earlier that night. And apparently his box office kind of tanked. But Louis sold out. There was not, like you said, there wasn't a tremendous amount of advanced publicity, but there was enough to, really drum up the buzz that this is going to be something special. Louis Armstrong all night with a small group. I mean, come on, we need to see this. And Anderson was very smart. He brought along recording equipment, which in the pre-tape era involved, acetate discs and a disc cutter, which is why the sound quality of what survives from Town Hall is kind of all over the place. But that night, like I said, my first book started there. My current book ends there. That is like if you could boil Louis Armstrong's entire career to like one concert, that's the concert, because it's him playing the music of the 20s and 30s, including songs like we started tonight by hearing Cornet Chop Suey, which is a Hot 5 classic. He hadn't done that in 20 years. And so to start with that, and then go on through, Rockin' Chair and even do the pop stuff. He does Pennies from Heaven from the film of the same name. He does Do You Know What It Means to Miss New Orleans. He does Guy Lombardo's Sweethearts on Parade. So he's still showing that, he's not Bunk Johnson. He's going to still give you Louis Armstrong, but it's no longer, shackled to the big band. It's this kind of freewheeling, fresh, small group thing. And by the end of that night, Joe Glazer hired Jack Teagarden immediately, and the writing was on the wall. You know, the big band would be broken up in early July, and Armstrong never looked back. They formed the All Stars in August of 1947, and of course, people came and went, but that small group became his format for the next, the last 24 years of his career.
Well, let's listen to Armstrong reading the liner notes, and thank you for this clip, Ricky.
All over the world, America is known for baseball, movie stars, cocktail bars, disc jockeys, and a few other strictly American phenomena. But I suppose more than anything else, we Americans are known for our jazz musicians. Our hot music is America's great cultural contribution to the creative art of the world, and its foremost contributor is nothing less than the living legend. He didn't learn to sing in Milan. He got his voice training with a New Orleans newsboy quartet that used to chirp on the curbstone for pennies. He didn't learn to play the trumpet in a conservatory. He practiced on a battered old bugle in the New Orleans Waifs Home for Boys. His professors were the sons of Old Man River, the musicians who worked the Mississippi excursion boats. He was born back of town in the slums with every possible obstacle before him, and yet his genius took him across the world to triumph in concert halls, command performance before kings, and critical acclaim by the music journals of every country. His great records have spread the gospel of jazz to every nook and corner of our planet. His influence on music, singers, and musicians has been tremendous. There's a little bit of him in every one of our best popular artists. Jazz is a term that is much abused, but if it has any meaning at all, it means exactly what happens whenever he lifts his trumpet, whenever he throws his head back and curls his voice around a song. This is one of the greatest musical aggregations of all time, led by America's most gifted creative musician, Louis Armstrong. Fred Robbins. After this introduction, Louis Armstrong went on to play a concert which was acclaimed as one of the milestones in jazz. We are certain you will enjoy the cream of this concert, which we have included on this record as much as the audience did that night. Isn't that wonderful?
Oh, I love that. That isn't that wonderful. It's so heartfelt. I mean, he just sat there reading these notes about how he changed the world and wrote rags to riches and influenced everybody. It's like, isn't that wonderful? I mean, it's so touching. But yeah, that's from the tapes, because Ernie Anderson, like I mentioned, recorded the whole concert, and 6 songs came out in 1948 on an RCA Victor album, and that's what Louis was reading the notes for there. Eventually, all the discs turned up, and in the 80s, the complete concert came out, and then I put it out on a Mosaic record set that I co-produced, this complete Columbia and RCA Victor live recordings of the All Stars. That's on Spotify. And the whole first disc is the complete town hall concert. So urge you to check it out, because it's, like I said, it's probably the defining moment, in terms of concerts, the defining concert in Armstrong's career.
It's a great recording. And it's not just on Spotify, it's on all streaming services, right?
Yes, yeah, correct. It's everywhere. Yep. Just look up. You can look up Louis at Town Hall. There might be a separate thing, but the set I worked on was the Columbia and RCA Victor live recordings of Louis Armstrong and the All Stars, and that one we used the original metal parts and we tried remastering it as best as we could, and that's the first, whatever's, if it's on Apple Music or Spotify, wherever you find it, it opens, boom, right there with Town Hall.
Well, can you tell us about the response to this recording and then also to the All-Stars in general?
Yeah, two different answers there. The response to the night at Town Hall is unanimous, just praise and just everybody gushing that they couldn't believe it. It lived up to the expectations. It exceeded the expectations. Standing room only crowd, and the jazz fans who had been so hard on Armstrong, they just couldn't believe that he did this. And the truth is, he did it really for one night only. Because when he forms the All-Stars, he immediately realizes that, okay, jazz is changing. It's becoming more of a concert hall music. There's an audience now staring back. Oh, wait a minute. Where have I had an audience staring back at me? Oh, the Apollo, for one thing. And so almost immediately, he used to travel with the review, where Armstrong's big band would be featured. Louis would come out, would do one or two show pieces. Then he would bring on the comedians. Then he would bring on the acrobats. Then he would do one or two songs. Then he would bring on whatever else. It was a variety bill. All that gets stripped away, and now it's just him and his 6-piece band. He goes, well, what am I going to do? He brings back Velma Middleton, who was the female vocalist in his big band. The two of them were the greatest at comedic duets, and they really did have such a close friendship with each other. And so Velma's there to provide this like comedic foil, comic relief. And then Louis needs to be the one-man show. So now he used to have a male singer. Now he's the male singer. He would do La Vie en Rose and Kiss to Build a Dream On and all the big pop hits. And he would feature all the members of the band instead of featuring a variety acts. But he would be there to introduce them, to play riffs and back them up. And so really, the All-Stars becomes basically, everybody thought this was like the saviors of jazz, but it really becomes like a small group vaudeville outfit, keeping the traditions of the Apollo and African-American humor and showbiz and pop music and everything else, all of it together night after night. And the interesting thing is the All-Stars becomes the most popular period of Armstrong's entire career. And you know how I feel about the music, but the jazz community immediately, they're like, nope, we thought this was going to be something different. This is not what we asked for. And so they get the knives back out and give him the worst reviews of his career the last 24 years. But what hurts Armstrong until the day he died was the African-American audience. And again, bringing it back to the Apollo, I think they were still with him to an extent, but by breaking up the big band and going back to the small group, and even though the All-Stars swung like a rock and roll band, they still had that trumpet, trombone, clarinet thing. They would still play songs like Muskrat Ramble and Back Home Again in Indiana. And even though the musicians were incredible and the music was incredible, it didn't sound like 1949 or 1951. It didn't sound like what was in vogue. And so Brad alluded to it earlier, but the All-Stars come back to the Apollo in 48 and 49 and 52. And the reviews are great and the box office is great. I looked for the moment where the Apollo audience turns on Louis Armstrong, and it doesn't exist. But what happens is the trends change so much, and the sound of the All-Stars, there were other African-American traditional jazz acts, Sidney Bechet, Red Allen, Wilbur de Paris. None of them were playing the Apollo anymore by the 1950s. And so after 1952, Louis never plays the Apollo again for the last 19 years of his life. And in the year he dies, Frank Schiffman's son, Jack Schiffman, writes a book in which he talks about how even a superstar like Louis Armstrong is rejected. The Apollo wanted nothing to do with a Dixieland band, which harks back to Uncle Tom and this and that. And so it's an interesting thing that we can play devil's advocate all we want, but if Louis keeps the big band, does he keep a big chunk of the black audience? I don't know, but it's a weird thing where he makes this format change after Town Hall and has the greatest success of his life, but loses the hardcore jazz fans and critics and the hardcore African-American audience. And again, I always have to say, not 100%. The Wall Street Journal reviewed my book over the weekend, and the writer, the review, Will Friedwald, mentioned that Armstrong lost most of his black audience by the 1960s. Like the first comment was, "I'm African American. My parents loved him. They took me to see him in the 60s." So whatever we say, it's never 100%. Armstrong had black supporters, till the end. But the overwhelming popularity he had with breaking records and all that stuff, that's definitely gone by the mid 50s.
Well, Brad, thinking about pop music changing, and you talked about this a little, Ricky, pop music moves away from jazz, and it's the crooners and it's certain types of other kinds of artists. That's also happening at the Apollo as well, is that other acts are taking over, right?
Right. If we're looking, because the last Armstrong run is that New Year's show 52, 53. And Frank Schiffman and his son Bobby, who are running the theater by now, they're really shrewd at gauging the Harlem audience. They've got scouts in the record stores. They got relationships with the local DJs, and they're trying to perfect a balancing act where they're getting up and coming stars who are hot, but who are not commanding huge fees yet. And so you can see how what Armstrong's doing at this period doesn't really fit into that model. And Ricky alluded to Jack Schiffman's book where he said, that Dixieland doesn't play uptown anymore. So at this point at the Apollo, what's emerging is more R&B, jump blues kind of stuff. Looking at 53, Louis Jordan and his Timpani 5, archetypal jump blues band. They're booked. They're held over for 3 weeks. On screen now is Wynonie Harris, who's a great jump blues shouter. He was booked twice. You saw a second ago Ruth Brown. She did 3 separate 3-week runs at the Apollo that year. As far as the old guard of performers who played the Apollo in 53, Ella Fitzgerald was in for a week, but I don't think what she was doing at that point was hearkening back in the same way that what Armstrong was doing. And then Lionel Hampton also played the Apollo, but Lionel Hampton's music always had a pretty heavy jump blues component and was high energy and could still fit into this more modern context. So it all makes sense, and I can see why what the All-Stars what they were doing, which was still fantastic, and nobody has listened to more hours of the All-Stars than Ricky, and they had good nights and bad nights, but on their best nights they were transcendent and they were incredibly powerful. But it doesn't fit into the Apollo model by this point.
Yeah,
it's interesting. This is a real quick side note. In his spare time, we have Lewis's tapes from the 1950s. And what is he listening? What is he dubbing to tape? I mean, he listens to everything: classical, opera, you name it, bop. But he listens to he records a lot of R&B radio, and so we have these tapes from the early 50s where Lewis is listening to Ruth Brown and Wynonie Harris and all these people. And I think he really enjoyed that music. You listen to his one recording with Louis Jordan, he sounds right at home. And so one does wonder, I think the All-Stars were just such a natural for the box office. Again, maybe not for the Apollo box office, but you're only paying 6 musicians. They're all world class. It just made so much money and so much sense. But his recordings in the late 40s and early 50s, I mean, they're some of the most popular records he ever made. They're all with big bands, Stacey Bone, Cy Oliver, and Lavie and Rose. And a buddy of mine told me an anecdote once about Lewis returning to New Orleans. This is sometime in, I think, probably 1952. And like the hardened New Orleans, quote unquote, moldy figs showed up, and they were excited to hear Muskrat Ramble and to hear the good old good ones. But they said that the African Americans in the audience responded the most to Blueberry Hill and to the pop stuff. And so, it really is just, again, it's a complete hypothetical. But if Lewis continued with a big band, with Cy Oliver's big band, and continued having these chart-topping hits like "Kiss the Bill to Dream On" and Blueberry Hill and stuff like that. Could he have maintained that run at the Apollo? We'll never know.
And just to reiterate, like as you said, Ricky, he didn't fall off at the Apollo. The box office never dropped. I mean, we have Frank Schiffman's notes, and Armstrong's fees go up every time he's back. So there was no outright rejection. In fact, the popularity of the All-Stars might have put the fee, higher than what the Schiffmans were willing to pay at that point. That could be as much a factor, or
that's
part of the
a great
equation.
point. No, that's a great point, because Louis doesn't play New York City often. That's people think
That was the point I
this
was
golden. What's that?
The point I was about to make is that he does not have a legacy at Town Hall, but he has an album.
No,
that's
right.
it.
Town Hall one night.
One night and an album. And I think so it's like 100% of the times that he performs at Town Hall, he recorded. It's just like a crazy statistic for us. And he's in some ways a big outlier, even in our jazz history, it feels like, because everybody who came a lot. So we have a huge history with Duke Ellington, a huge history with Dizzy Gillespie, even folks like Thelonious, who didn't come a lot necessarily, did come multiple times. And so there's this huge question mark around Louis Armstrong in our history. And of course, seems to make sense, because it wasn't something that his manager really booked. He was brought on. This is not a gig that he sought or that his manager sought, tried to make happen. He was an invited guest. In the promo, he's a guest. His name is in tiny print in the promo for this. So it's like an album came out of it sounds like a last minute add-on.
Right. No. Yeah, for me to call it a defining concert, but it really is a one night only thing. And I mean, Louis does play New York, but like Brad mentioned, the All-Stars were a high paying attraction. And so throughout the 50s, they play a nightclub called Basin Street every year. They play huge theaters like the Roxy. They play the Copacabana nightclub, but it was usually like once a year. At one point, he doesn't step foot in New York. I think it's December 57 until like April of 61. He's living in New York and hanging out in New York, but he's always on the road, or he's in Europe or Africa or touring. And so, he's just not there playing a week at the 5 spot or, coming back to Town Hall. He is a road warrior. So that's also part of it, like, which I think is worth pointing out, that the places that paid Armstrong in New York, there were these high rolling nightclubs and theaters that could, the people had to pay to get in to see him. So,
and were the All-Stars kind of built for one-nighters? I mean, were they playing runs in theaters and clubs?
Early on, they did a lot of theaters, and in New York, they would do, like I said, when they played the Paramount or the Roxy or Basin Street, it was usually a week or two at a time. There's one Basin Street run 54, I think it's like 6 weeks or something. But most of the time, it's the one-nighters. The major cities, they had their engagements. If they went to Chicago, it'd be a week at the Blue Note. If they went to San Francisco, it'd be a week at Club Hangover. But in between, I mean, we have interviews with Armstrong where he mentions he's getting in the middle of like 55 straight one-nighters. Or during like prom season and all, they would do high schools and they would do colleges. And there are photos of this band that's like on Ed Sullivan and like, making MGM movies, playing high school gymnasiums, because that was the life.
Wow. Well, I want to get to some questions that folks have before we, close out. You answered about folks' question about the manager, but beside Dizzy or Miles, did any 60s jazz trumpeters like Lee Morgan, Don Cherry, or others who were considered hip and modern, could they be spotted in the audience checking out Louis since he laid the trumpet rules down? This is from Joseph Bell.
Yeah, no question about it. I think Art Farm, this was also in the Wall Street Journal this weekend, but Art Farmer said, nobody who ever played trumpet ever viewed Louis Armstrong as an Uncle Tom. So from the trumpet standpoint, he was so ubiquitous in the 30s and 40s on radio and in movies that whole generation that kind of took over the 50s and 60s, they had to deal with him. Miles Davis has the famous quote, "You can't play anything on the trumpet that Louis Armstrong didn't play first, even modern." There's one interview, Clifford Brown names him as his favorite trumpet player. Maynard Ferguson named the Decca Strutting with Some Barbecue as his favorite Armstrong recording. And so, and there were interviews, the Downbeat did a round table in '59 where Art Farmer and Quincy Jones and all this kind of stuff. So even when Louis looked like he was slipping in the eyes of the jazz critics, the musicians were still listening. Dan Morgenstern tells a great story of going to Basin Street, and Miles Davis was one table over, and he was actually shushing his party because he's like, "I'm trying to hear pops," and he was just. Dan said from one fan to another, he could clearly tell that Miles was a fan. He was loving every moment of it. So, even if Louis isn't playing bebop or hard bop or cool or whatever, without him, there's none of that. And I think those trumpet players realized that.
Now, Ricky, going back to the era covered by the new book, I was wondering. I grew up with the jazz critic cultivated, Armstrong myth that you've so successfully kind of deconstructed. This idea that, the hot fives and hot sevens were the pinnacle, and everything after 29 is all showmanship and commercial. I was just wondering, from what I understand, I could be wrong, the hot fives, hot sevens were sort of a recording group. They didn't necessarily perform. The music from the era of the book, the big band era, would you say that is more indicative of what he was doing night after night and what the culture was responding to, what the press was responding to? Like, that's a weird disjunct for me.
Yeah, I have to be very careful because I sometimes I think I come off as anti hot fives and hot sevens, and I would I would never do that.
I would never assume
but
you would
having
do that.
But having said that, like you said, they were a recording group, and none of them thought they were making history. They were all old friends. I mean, Johnny Dodds and Kid Ory and Louis, that's the front line of the old Ory band, and Johnny St. Cyr played with Louis on the Riverboat. So they were old New Orleans homeboys, recording their music and having fun. And as soon as they left the studio, Louis went and played with big bands. He played with Erskine Tate Symphony Orchestra. He played reviews at the Sunset Cafe. And more than that, he did comedy and he did pop songs and Broadway tunes and preacher routines. And so all this stuff is there. So the myth of Louis Armstrong is this serious artist in the 20s, this tortured artist who was forced to go commercial and sell out and do comedy and love songs. It's such a joke because that is his whole that's the whole 1920s for him. And when you listen to the complete hot fives and hot sevens, you'll hear it. You'll hear him play slide whistle solos and do the West Indian routine on King of the Zulus and sing all these Irish Black Bottom and things like that. So to me, no one's asked it yet, but I'll answer it before it's asked. I'm eventually going to write about the first 28 years. I don't know when or where. I don't have a deal yet, but it's incomplete unless I do it. And my goal is when I'm done and when people see the 3 books back to back to back, there's an incredible consistency in Armstrong's career. Does he change? Does his style evolve? Does the musical world evolve? Sure. But the same combination of trumpet playing and showmanship and singing and scatting and comedy and love songs and romance and virtuosity, it's the same in the 20s as it is in the 30s, as it is in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. It could be with the Hot Five. It could be with a big band. It could be with Oscar Peterson. It could be with the strings of Gordon Jenkins. It could be with the Oliver Nelson's big band. He is who he is, and he's always 100% himself, and he's secure in what he can do in any of those situations. So more to come on that subject. But yeah. God bless the hot fives and hot sevens for their impact and for showing what jazz can be and what a soloist can do. But that's a blip on the radar of what Louis was doing night in and night out in that period.
Well, I'm also interested in thinking about him as a cultural figure. But, when I think about other jazz musicians who are, I mean, virtuosic and dedicated to craft. But that craft actually also includes entertaining. So, you know, being able to be different parts of a variety show, right? Being able to make the crowd laugh, or to, you know, be a part of a comedy duo in some sense, right? Being able to perform a monologue or perform a song as well. I wonder if you could talk about some other artists who you think are comparable in that way, and do you think that Dizzy Gillespie is one who can be included in that?
1,000%. Yeah, the three I always lump together, and I always say that jazz education doesn't do this. Brad read my mind. Louis
Yeah.
Armstrong, Dizzy Gillespie, and Clark Terry. I think those are three artists to study who are instantly identifiable. They each had a sound, you know it's them within 2 seconds. And that's every jazz musician's dream. Everybody complains that the jazz schools are churning out all these, you know, Coltrane's down to legs, so you can't tell them apart. Those three, you know it's them in 2 seconds. Incredibly virtuosic. You know, what they each did was unique to themselves, and to pull it off is not easy. It's the height of, you know, musical intellectualism, whatever you want to call it. And all three were gifted comedians and entertainers and showmen, and they knew how to pace their sets. They knew when to call a ballad, when to call a love song. You listen to Dizzy's live albums at, you know, Newport and all that stuff, where, you know, he would introduce the band and do all the hijinks. That went over, and that was their way to kind of get the music across. And all three of them, I mean, Dizzy and Clark didn't really have hit records like Louis did. I mean, maybe Clark's mumbles a little bit, but all three of them, until they were old and gray, they would be booked on TV. And, you know, I remember seeing Clark Terry on Letterman and Dizzy on the Muppet Show and stuff like that. And so that's the kind of thing. And I think some people bristle at that because more people follow the Miles and Charlie Parker method that, you know, listen, I don't need to do that. I don't want to do that. I'm an artist. I'm a musician. Can't my music speak for itself? And yes, you know, that's, you know, nobody should say that, yeah, everybody needs to be a showman. But when people wonder, you know, why jazz has kind of fallen off the radar, or why, you know, everybody sounds the same, or musicians playing for musicians, that those artists, they came from that old school. They, you know, to win over a crowd at the Apollo, you know, that's, you know, that's a badge of honor. And to go back to the book for a minute, I mean, Dizzy kind of becomes, you know, like the antagonist of the second half of the book, because he is the most vocal critic of Armstrong, calling his music Uncle Tom music, calling him, you know, him a plantation character. I mean, my goodness. But I didn't see this until the book was finished, so I didn't get to put it in the book. But recently, I watched the old HBO documentary on Larry Bird and Magic Johnson, and it talked about how their rivalry was so intense, and they hated each other, and the fans hated each other, and it was just And then eventually, they buried the hatchet. I think it's Brian Gumbel at the end. He goes, well, really what it comes down to is they were both the same person. And so I think that's Louis and Dizzy, you know, beating each other up in public and criticizing the music and, you know, this and that. But they both came from poor upbringing. They both came from the South. They were both geniuses. They both changed the sound of music, and they were both gifted comedians. And eventually they do bury the hatchet. Dizzy moves a block away from Louis in Corona, Queens. Louis tells off the president, Eisenhower, during the Little Rock thing, wins a brand new respect, and the two of them became, you know, best buds till the end of Louis's life. And Dizzy spent the rest of his life talking about how great Louis was. So long answer to a pretty straightforward question, but, you know, definitely I think jazz education should spend more time, you know. The notes are one thing, but connecting with audiences is a whole different subject.
Thank you. And, you know, we're going to take these two Joe Glazer questions. People are interested in Joe Glazer. Okay. Are there films or interviews of Joe Glazer? Yeah, that's one question. And then the other question, and you may be able to do these together. Did Armstrong play Connie's Inn? And did his conflict with the Innermans have anything to do with bringing about his relationship with Joe Glazer?
Yep. Okay. Here we go. There's There's one surviving audio interview with Glazer, and it's in Louis Armstrong's tape collection. It's on Hawaiian radio. But otherwise, Glazer lived the most guarded life imaginable. When he died, nobody knows where his business papers ended up. I know they don't survive. This is a man who was probably the top booking artist in Black entertainment for like a 30-year period, and he doesn't have a Wikipedia entry. And I think my book has probably gone on deepest. If I end up disappearing one day, it might be because of that. But it's just this life of mystery, where he was an incredible New York character, and he would make it into the newspapers, and everybody knew who he was, and his artists did love him. I mean, Billie Holiday was loyal to the end. Louis was loyal to the end. He had Barbra Streisand, he had Dr. John, he had B.B. King, and Lionel Hampton. They all know you can't find his artists saying a bad word about him. But there's nothing. So no Wikipedia page, no video. No one's done a documentary. If you watch The Black Godfather on Netflix, the Clarence Avant documentary, he's got some great insight because Glazer hired him. And so again, it's the complexities of this man. Glazer hires Clarence Avant, an African American in the 60s, gives him a huge job, makes him move to Beverly Hills, gets him a house, and Clarence Avant won't say a bad word about Glazer. He worships Glazer. And so there's something there for somebody to really dig deep. I mean, I dug fairly deep, and still the fact that so much is gone and all of his associates are gone, that story might never get the treatment it deserves. In terms of Connie's Inn, yes, Louis played Connie's Inn in 29, and that is the start of the whole gangster issue, because in 1930, they sent him a contract that they wanted him to come back in 31. And this is when Tommy Rockwell was still booking Armstrong. But by 31, Louis had already switched allegiances to Johnny Collins, and so they just ignored the Immermans. And so flash forward to April of 31, Louis is in Chicago, and the Immermans send Rockwell and 3 other basically hoodlums to kind of try to extort Armstrong. Yeah, they want $6,000. They threaten to burn Johnny Collins' mustache off. All this kind of, unless Louis came back to Connie's Inn, and they refused, and it was a whole big thing. But then the next day, a legitimate killer, a guy named Frank Foster, shows up, sticks a gun in Armstrong's ribcage. Louis gets on the phone to one of the Immerman brothers saying, I heard you're coming to New York, and Louis says, yeah, I'll be there tomorrow. But instead of going to New York, Johnny Collins calls the police. And every night in the Chicago engagement, Louis had to give a police escort. And then for the next year, everywhere they went down south. They went on a vaudeville tour. They had to get bodyguards. There were people, trying to mess with Armstrong every step of the way. And so Glazer, again, made all that disappear. And after the Apollo, where is Louis Armstrong's big New York comeback in 1935? The new Connie's Inn in Midtown Manhattan, burying all hatchets and whatever with the Immermans. So deep stuff, and gangsters' fingerprints all over everything.
And all in the book.
Yes.
All. Yeah.
Well, we'll take this last one before we close. What was Louis's relationship with Bing Crosby?
All right, this is good. This is another chance to clear up misperceptions. Louis loved Bing. Bing loved Louis, and that's pretty much it. The two of them didn't socialize, and that's because neither of them were the Hollywood types. Bing did not hang out with Frank Sinatra and Bob Hope. He had his friends from Spokane, and that was his circle. And Louis didn't hang out with Duke Ellington and Billie Holiday. He had his friends from Chicago and Harlem, and that's who he hung out with. But in 1961, Louis did an Ebony interview in which they were asking him about racism in Hollywood. And he says, listen, he goes, I would feel a draft in a minute. He goes, those, they don't need to be inviting me to their homes. He goes, hey, Bing Crosby's never had me out to his home. But he goes, I would know if they were racist. And I feel the warmth from them, and they treat me well. And that's what really matters. And for 50, 60 years, people have gotten the scalpel and dug out Bing Crosby never invited to me to my home. And I swear to God, even on the Armstrong Facebook page or Instagram page, if we say Louis and Bing Crosby did this, I'll get 10 comments. Yeah, but Bing never had him to his home. It's like, oh my goodness, context, people, context.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that's, I think, the easiest way I can summarize it is, yeah, they weren't buddy, though they did smoke marijuana together. That was when they were together, that was their vice. They did it at the Metropolitan Theater in Boston in 36. You know, Louis tells stories about that. So they had that, and total mutual appreciation society. You know, you listen to Bing in the early 30s, you know, then you listen to Louis, they're both stealing from each other. But Bing admitted it. There's a 1958 Voice of America where Bing plays Louis's 1931 Lazy River, then he follows it with Bing's 1932 St. Louis Blues with Duke Ellington, and Bing launches into a scat thing that's almost identical. And he goes, to the radio audience, he goes, "Did you hear that?" He goes, "Unmistakable thievery." And so, you know, Bing knew it, but Bing, you know, he also said that Louis is the beginning and end of music in America, and I agree, and I think that's the perfect punctuation mark for this evening.
Well, I just want to, before we close out, just go around and just say what we have to say about our institutions. And Ricky, you can be you as the institution, but why the All-Stars or this period in particular is important to us. And I'll just say, it's a part of the legacy of our recordings for Town Hall. I think that's the major thing, is Town Hall has this legacy of recordings at the Hall, including, you know, Nina Simone's debut, Judy Collins at Town Hall. I mean, just a legacy of live recordings. And we have Louis Armstrong's All-Stars at the Hall. So that's definitely, I think, a major point of interest for us. And of course, what an incredible document that we have here at our hall. So I'm so excited to be here to talk about it with you two. Brad, would you mind just saying what the All-Stars and Louis Armstrong in particular mean to the Apollo?
I mean, I think of the Apollo as this, it's this nexus where, you know, popular music and popular culture as a whole connect with artists and connect with Harlem. And the relationship with Armstrong and the Apollo, it's bigger than a venue artist. It's, you know, it illustrates how electrifying and important Armstrong was as a personality, as an artist, as a, you know, as a point of civic pride. And the Apollo Association, knowing that he could come back from Europe after his lip was all torn up, and that's where he chose to, you know, to make his reintroduction to not just to America but to Harlem. I think is pivotal, and it shows just what Harlem and the Apollo meant to Louis, and what Louis meant to Harlem and the Apollo. So it's an extraordinary connection, and, you know, that's why his name is inlaid in the sidewalk out in front of the theater.
And Ricky, why this book? Ricky, are you frozen?
Brad hit all the right beats there. You know, the Apollo represents, you know, this period where, to African Americans, Louis is as big as Joe Louis. You know, he's an idol, and he never forgets those years. But Town Hall represents the other side, you know, that kind of the jazz musician playing with the small group, just, you know, improvising, the abandoned, the innovator from the 1920s, setting up that path for the rest of his years. And for us at the Louis Armstrong House Museum, I mean, you know, we are Queens centric. You know, most of our collection comes from those years in Queens, but the fact that he owned the Town Hall album, we didn't point it out, but when we were listening to that, him read the liner notes, all those photos were from his personal collection. They've never been published before. Everybody knows the one main photo, the William Gottlieb photo that we've shown a couple of times, but all those kind of fuzzy little snapshots, no one knows who took them. It was somebody in the audience, somebody close to Louis, and they only survive in our archives. And so he saved all those. He made collages from some of those. And same thing with the Apollo. You know, he saved clippings. The 1952 appearance, he recorded the entire evening, and he dubbed it to tape and gave it away to friends. In 1949, the Apollo had him back, and he said that he needed to do something special for the Apollo, and he brought in a choir to do that Lucky Old Son. And we have him on tape reflecting about that, saying, "Oh, the Apollo, I need to do something for the Apollo." And so I think even though he's living in Queens and he's conquering the world as Ambassador Satch, I think he had nothing but fond memories for both of those institutions.
Well, thank you both for coming. It's such an honor. Ricky, we're going to have to meet in person. I'm sorry that it was all online. Brad, for those who don't know, Brad is a great friend to me and a great help to me as I learn how to do a lot of this digital archiving work. So thank you, Brad, for everything. I want to say thank you also to everyone who is watching tonight. We have more programs coming up. For those of you who haven't been watching, we have been doing these about twice a month, although in the last month it's been almost, or last 2 months it's been almost every week. We just go through our history. So the next one that we have is actually on Halloween. It is about Sun Ra and his concert for the comet Kahutek, which was a comet that was coming really close to Earth in 1973. And so Sun Ra and the orchestra performed a concert in honor of the comet and then recorded it. So we will be talking about the comet, because I do want to talk about the astronomy and the astrology. We will be talking about the album, and we will be talking about Sun Ra with Dr. John Sved, who is the great biographer of almost every jazz musician I really love, but of Sun Ra. And we will be talking about this on October 31st, which you may remember is Halloween, but is also the night of the blue moon, which is the second full moon of a month. And strangely enough, it falls on Halloween. So come join us for a very strange night, which I hope is a very strange night, and sign up for our newsletter so you can find out about some more of our programming. We will be coming back to jazz to talk about Lady Day's debut. We'll be talking about Duke Ellington, who's had many series at our hall. We'll be talking about other jazz important events, like the Thelonious Monk's Orchestra's only recording, which was recorded at Town Hall. So please do come back and learn more with us, because I always learn as I do these. Thank you to everyone at Town Hall for helping me make this program. On the back end, we've got Alex, who produces these, Jeff, who also produces these, our staff and board who make this possible. If you'd like to support Town Hall so we can make programs like this, please go to www.thetownhall.org/donate. And I want to go back to Brad and Ricky for a second. Ricky, you've got a book you're working on. No pressure.
Right now, I'm just working on breathing.
Okay, breathe.
Yeah, but it'll happen.
Okay. I know that you, Brad, got a big shipment this week that you're working through.
Yeah, we got 2 big shipments. One of materials from one of the original Showtime at the Apollo producers, who sent us about 45 boxes of business records and videotapes. And a lot of people these days know about the Apollo from the syndicated Showtime at the Apollo show. And then our old technical director, who worked there in the late 80s, early 90s, lent us 60 videotapes from his basement. So we're going through those, and there's fantastic stuff there from the 80s and 90s. And the Apollo is still producing shows. We're talking about history tonight, but the Apollo's still making history. Our whole fall season is digital. It's all free, and there's great stuff happening. So just be sure to check out www.apollotheater.org. Or if you have any questions about the archives, just email me at archives@apollotheater.org. Maybe you have some cool stuff you want to share with us. We'd love to see it.
Well, thank you both. If you wouldn't mind, Ricky, would you take us out into this video of Black and Blue. Where are we? Where is this?
Yeah, so this is actually the climax to my first book, the What a Wonderful World book. This is March 1965, and I referenced earlier 1957. Lewis told off President Eisenhower, put his career on the line to speak out against injustice, but he got such criticism from both the white and black press that he kind of buttoned up after that for the next few years. He was at the height of his popularity, and people would ask him questions occasionally, and he would kind of spin out of it. But in '65, the March on Selma, Alabama occurred, Bloody Sunday, and Armstrong was on his way to go behind the Iron Curtain for the first time. And so he was in Denmark when a reporter asked him about Bloody Sunday, and he said it made him sick. And he said that, Hitler's been dead a long time, or is he? And then the reporter said, well, we don't see you out there marching. What are you doing for the cause? And Armstrong got very upset, and he goes, listen, the best thing I can do, because I make my donations and all, he goes, but the best thing I can do is play my music. And if I was going to go out there and march, the first thing they would do would be to beat me. If they hit me in the mouth, I couldn't play the trumpet. I couldn't do what I do the best. And the reporter goes, oh, come on. You think they would really beat you, Louis Armstrong? And he said they would beat Jesus if he was black and marched. And that made headlines all over the world. And so now Armstrong shows up behind the Iron Curtain, and everybody's ready, especially the communist press and all. They cannot wait to ask you, tell me more about the South. Tell me more about racism. Blast America. This is great. And he's too smart for that. He knows he's the ambassador of goodwill. So he just keeps saying, come to my concerts. Come to my trumpet does the talking, And on this tour, he brings back a song that he hadn't done with any regularity in quite a number of years. And it's Fats Waller and Andy Razeff's What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue, which Lewis first recorded in 1929, and which is generally regarded as one of the first protest songs. And every night, every surviving performance from this tour, from Prague, from East Berlin, even Budapest, Black and Blue is always in the number 3 spot. He does it slower than he ever did it before and more dramatic. And so this video we're going to close with is from East Berlin, March 22nd, 1965. And it's the All-Stars. You're going to see Tyree Glenn on trombone, Eddie Shue on clarinet, Billy Kyle on piano, Arvell Shaw on bass, Danny Barcelona on drums. And yeah, this comes from German television. Like I said, it was the climax of my first book, but it shows the weight of the world on this guy, trying at the height of his popularity. This knocked the Beatles off the charts. He's 64 years old, but still, bristling about 60 years of witnessing racism and injustice and getting the message out through his music.
That's good. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, folks. Here's one of our recordings. Beautiful number called Black and Blue. Yes, sir. bed, spring's hard as lead, feel like golden dead, wished I was dead. What did I do to be so black and blue? Even the mouse ran from my house. They laugh at you, scorn you too. What did I do to be so black and blue? Yes, I'm right inside, but that don't help my case, 'cause I can't hide what is in my face. But that does I say, how would it end? Ain't got a friend. My only sin is in my skin. What did I do to be so black and blue?